Good afternoon, and welcome to Recurring Issues when advising employees about big book deals who are coming into or exiting government. My name is Patrick Shepard. I'm a senior instructor here at the Institute for Ethics in Government, and I'm very pleased to be joined by Seth Jaffe, who is the Chief of OGE's Ethics Law and Policy Branch. Welcome, Seth.
Hi, Patrick.
Hi, so we have a lot to get through today, so I want to keep our administrative remarks brief. We do have an opportunity to ask questions. If you have questions as we go through the presentation, please email them to Michelle Worthington, the other instructor here at the Institute for Ethics in Government. She'll be monitoring her mailbox, and we'll have some time to answer those questions at the end. And if you're looking for her email address, it is in the course description on the page where you are watching this presentation. So I think right now I'll turn it over to Seth because we have a lot of interesting content to get through.
Thanks a lot, Patrick. And thank you all for attending today's presentation on our recently issued legal advisory, LA 20-06, advising employees who want to sell a book idea. Today's presentation should take about 30 to 40 minutes, including questions. So as many of you know, in 2008, we issued a legal advisory, LA 08-006. And in that advisory, we really took a detailed and thorough look on all the rules and laws and executive orders that apply to employees who want to write a book and get paid for it. So hopefully many of you have had an opportunity to look at that advisory as well as the charts and tables that really help people understand those rules. And in 2008, that was the last time that we had a full presidential transition. So in the lead up to this election, regardless of whether or not it was going to be a full transition, we thought it was a good time to update some of our advice because that's a time when there are a lot of people leaving government service, a time where a lot of people are entering government service who might need advice on whether they can write a book and get paid for it. Now, since the issuance of that 2008 advisory, which was very detailed, we've received a lot of specific questions that were not addressed in that advisory, questions concerning the compensation limitations and restrictions that apply to book deals. So these questions over the last decade or so, we've given consistent oral advice on these questions, but I'm not sure that these answers were known throughout the wider ethics community. So in LA 20-06, which we released in September, it addresses the application of the compensation-related restrictions in the context of an employee who, one, wants to update a book written prior to government service, two, engage in promotional activities as it relates to that book, and three, it also addresses questions concerning employees who want to shop a book around or sell a book idea when they're in the process of leaving government service. So these are the specific questions that were addressed in LA 20-06, which we'll go over today shortly. But before we jump right into the specific rules and laws that apply to those questions, I want to just take a couple of minutes to reflect on the main purposes that are behind these regulations, placing limitations on the employee's ability to get paid for outside writing. So I put pictures of two people on the screen here, two very pleasant-looking people. And first, take a look at them and see if you recognize who they are. And think to yourself if they have something in common. Now, who they are, the person on the left is Catherine Pugh, the recent former mayor of Baltimore. And the person on the right is Jim Wright, the former Speaker of the U.S. House of Representatives. Now that you know who they are, what do you think that they have in common? And that is that both of these public officials resigned their positions amid book deal scandals. Now, Catherine Pugh, the former mayor of Baltimore, recently pled guilty to federal crimes tied to a children's book series she wrote. She pled guilty after the FBI investigated her writing and selling a series of books known as Healthy Holly books, with titles like Exercising is Fun and Vegetables Are Not Just Green. However, money is. I added that last bit. While she was a board member of the University of Maryland medical system, she sold books to that very same medical system. The arrangement generated approximately $800,000 for the ex-mayor, much of it from companies that had business ties to city government. In addition, it was subsequently discovered that the $800,000 in payments were significantly more than the book contract was objectively worth. So the charges she pled guilty to, wire fraud conspiracy, conspiracy to defraud the government, and 2 counts of tax evasion, carried a maximum penalty of 35 years in prison. Subsequently, she was sentenced to 3 years in prison and 3 years probation. So Jim Wright, the not-so-recent former Speaker of the House of Representatives. In 1989, he resigned as the Speaker as a result of an ethics investigation by House Ethics Committee into sales of his book of speeches and essays. Mr. Wright was suspected of circumventing House rules on outside income by accumulating about $54,000 in royalties from bulk sales of his 1984 book, Reflections of a Public Man. The accusation was that in lieu of campaign contributions or speaking fees, which were tightly regulated, groups with business before the House made bulk purchases of his book. In April 1989, the Ethics Committee reported that it found reason to believe that Mr. Wright had violated the rules of congressional conduct. So I just want to make a point here before we go on. We all know that the ethics rules and laws in this area can be very complicated and difficult sometimes to provide guidance on. But I want us all to keep in mind the very important purposes animating these rules. Specifically, these rules are designed to ensure, among other things, that executive branch officials do not receive bribes in the form of bogus payments for writing. Now, more subtly, the rules are designed to ensure that any executive branch official who gets paid to write a book while they are in government service should first be paid an amount commensurate with the service they provide. Second, concern a topic they actually have expertise in. Third, ensure the book is not related to their official duties. And fourth, be offered by a source who is not in a position to benefit from actions the employee takes on the job. So take a moment to think about if these 4 purposes are achieved through the rules, what ultimately is achieved? And what ultimately is achieved is that employees will be ensured that they are not using their public office for private gain. And in fact, they should really endeavor to avoid the appearance that they are using their public office for private gain, using the authority and power of their office in order to get people to buy their books. Now, even ultimately after that, there's one more purpose. And if this can be achieved, we assure that there's not even the appearance that public officials are using their public office to enrich themselves through illegitimate book deals, then the trust in government decision-making by the public can be increased. Because in these examples, for ex-Mayor Pugh and ex-Speaker Wright, the way in which they achieved their book deals would definitely call into question the integrity of their decision-making. And that's what these rules are designed to prevent. This isn't to say that federal government employees in the executive branch can't write books on the outside and get paid for them. It's just they need to do it consistent with these rules to ensure trust in government decision-making is maintained. So when we're going through some of these specific rules and you have an employee who is asking you for some advice here, I just ask that we keep these purposes in mind while we're giving the advice. Okay. So let's move on to Legal Advisory 20-06. And you'll see here that we're on OGE's relatively new website. So I just want to take a minute to show you the best ways to use the search tools to access the advisory. Now, first thing I'll mention is that, as you can see, this is the landing page for the new website. And one thing I want to mention is that this landing page that you see here is not the full landing page. That's the amount of the landing page that you can see on your screen. So if you want to scroll down, you'll see that there is more landing page here. Now, if you want to do a search for ethics rules or laws, you'll see down here on popular tasks, there's find the ethics rules. Another way to search for the ethics rules is resources for ethics officials. If you click on the drop-down menu, you'll see over to the right, conduct legal research. So these are different ways to get to legal research tools. Now, conduct legal research or find the ethics rules will bring you to the same search engine. And we'll do that in a second. One other thing I want to point out here is now you're coming to the website and you're looking for the book deal advisory. You know it's a pretty recent one. So if you scroll down, you can look under what's new. And this is in chronological order. Here, we recently issued an advisory on virtual events and how to analyze them under the gift rules. Before that, we recently issued an advisory on the post-government employment restrictions in the current ethics pledge. Scrolling down a little bit more, you'll see that we recently issued a legal advisory on the application of 18 U.S.C. 205. And before that, we issued an advisory on crowdsourced fundraising and the ethics rules that apply. Now, until a few days ago, you would have seen the book deal advisory under what's new because that was in September. That was the end of September. We've been busy lately, so it's not under what's new anymore. But if you know you're looking for something very recent, you might find it under what's new. So it's not under what's new. So go to Resources for Ethics Officials, drop-down menu, Conduct Legal Research. So this is the new legal research search engine. I will say that I got used to the old search engine in the old website. When I initially started to use the new search engine, I was thinking, why is this so counterintuitive? And then I realized after using it a few times, wow, this is a really powerful search engine. It's actually a lot improved from the previous one. I'll just give you a little example. So up here, we have the advanced search tool. So this is the plain language tool search, the Boolean search. So let's say all you know is, well, book deal. I want to see what OGE has said on book deals. You can type in book deal and hit search. Then you have to scroll down. The results are here, but you have to scroll down. You'll see it hit 11 legal advisories, 2 program management advisories, a judicial opinion, and a Federal Register issuance. So these are the hits. And you'll see the very first hit here is the 2006 advisory. Over to the left, it has the relevance. So in decreasing relevance, that's how the hits are displayed. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see that there were 15 entries. And if you want to go to the next page, you have to go over here. So that's one way to find the advisory. You can see that's a real powerful tool if you want to know what's out there on a particular topic. I'm going to clear that search. And the website just loads for a second here to start over again. Now let's say you don't necessarily, you just want to search legal advisories. You don't want an overall search. You just want to search advisories. So you click on legal advisories, and then you can use the search tool down here. You can type in book deal. You type in book deal, and what you get is 5 legal advisories. You don't get the other hits because you were searching within legal advisories. So all you get are 5 hits now. If you scroll down to the bottom, you'll see there are only 5 entries. And the 5 hits you get are basically the previous book deal advisory with a couple of different citations from 2008. And the first hit you get is the advisory that we're looking for. Now let's say you know the legal advisory number that you're looking for. You don't need to type in book deal. So you type in, you're going to search legal advisories, and you type in search. LA-20-06. And you type that in, and there you go. The only hit you get is the advisory. That's it. So I just wanted to take that couple of minutes to show you different ways to search the new website. Very powerful search tool. So here's the advisory. So we're just going to take the next 15 minutes or so to walk through the advisory, to talk about some of the things that are covered there, and also for me to take any questions that you submit to the website, and Patrick will make me aware of any questions that are submitted. So as I said, this advisory is an advisory that follows on a very comprehensive advisory in 2008. This advisory is not as comprehensive. It's dealing specifically with employees who want to update a book they've previously written, which is very frequently a textbook, or an employee who wants to engage in promotional activities regarding their book, or employees who want to shop a book or sell a book idea on their way out of government service. Now, again, today we're going to talk about the answers to these questions in relation to compensation-related restrictions, the ability of employees to get paid for books that, and answers to questions that are related to the questions we just discussed. There are many other topics, ethics, rules, and laws that come into play other than compensation-related restrictions. There's misuse of position, there's use of title, there is 208 issues sometimes, 502 issues. We're not addressing those today. We're talking about the compensation-related restrictions. And so what do I mean when I say compensation-related restrictions? Well, there's two primary ones. There's 807, 2635-807 in the Standards of Conduct, and that's the restriction that says an employee can't get paid for writing a book outside of their government service for a book that is related to their government duties, related to their official duties. So that's an across-the-board ban for all employees. The other ban is basically an outsider income ban, and that breaks down into two. In the Executive Order 12674, basically it says that presidentially appointed people to full-time positions are not going to be able to have any earned income during the time of their appointment, whether it's writing or other services, or for other services. So that's the outsider income ban for presidentially appointed. There's also in the Ethics in Government Act a provision that limits the ability of high-ranking politicals who are not appointed by the president, covered non-career officials, from receiving more than 15% of an EL Level 2 salary in any calendar year. Easier way to remember that is basically covered non-career employees cannot make more than approximately $30,000 a year in outside earned income. So we have 807 that applies to all employees. You can't write a book outside of your government service that relates to your official duties. And then you have the outside income ban for presidentially appointed and the limit $30,000 limitation for the covered non-career employees. Now, what's critical for the application of these compensation-related restrictions are timing issues. Now, that's discussed in LA 08-06, but I'm just going to touch on that briefly here. Now, these timing issues go to whether or not the compensation limitations apply in the first instance. They don't necessarily get you to what the answer is about whether the person can write the book and get paid. Because remember, what we're talking about here are compensation restrictions. These rules do not prohibit, per se, the ability of an employee to write a book while they are in government service. These are restrictions and guardrails as to whether and how they may get paid for writing such a book. And so we have to know in the first instance whether these restrictions apply. And sometimes the timing can be tricky. So let's give a pretty simple example, and that's the example here that I think is illustrated in the advisory. So let's say compensation. When does the receipt of compensation start? Now, it's pretty simple under our rules. The receipt of compensation starts when a contract is signed. The definition of compensation includes all forms of consideration. And for those of you who ever took contracts law, basically that's what a contract is, a promise for a promise. I promise to write a book, you promise to pay me. That's consideration, and that is received when the contract is signed. So in this example, the person signs a book deal contract, say in June. The activity, they start writing in July, and they enter government service in August. The point is that these three things, the writing activity, the receipt of compensation, and government service, all have to overlap at one point in time in order for the compensation restrictions to apply. All that means is, now you know the rules kick in, now you have to apply them. So in this instance, to sign the contract in June, start writing in July. Now the compensation is being received consistently as long as the contract is in force. The writing takes months, and the government service starts. And as long as they overlap, as they do here, the compensation limitation rules apply. Okay, so I'm going to move on to the first part. If, Patrick, we don't have any questions so far.
We do not yet have any questions.
Okay. So, what about receiving compensation for an employee who wants to update a book that they have written? So the threshold question here is, someone has written a book, an employee is coming in. Very frequently, it's going to be in the context of a textbook because there aren't a lot of other books that are updated, but some are. But if you have a professor coming in and he or she has written a textbook, say the second edition of a textbook, and it's been completed before they come into government. Well, in that situation, under our chart, the activity of writing will have been completed prior to government service beginning. So a person can receive the payment for books they completed before they came into government because the rules don't even apply. Now, what if a person is going to update the textbook? They want to write a third edition of the textbook while they are in government service. Well, under 807, if the textbook relates to their official duties, they're not going to be able to update that textbook while in government service and receive compensation for the updating of that textbook. Because updating a textbook is writing, it would be during government service, and they'd be receiving compensation. Now, there are other restrictions other than 807, because 807 is the restriction that says you can't write in government service for a book that relates to your official duties. So in this example, the person's wanting to update their textbook, relates to their official duties, they can't get paid. Now, that's true for all employees. Now, the PA, the presidentially appointed, and the covered non-career employees, as we know, have additional compensation restrictions. The PA employee cannot receive any outsider income, and the covered non-career has about a $30,000 limitation in a calendar year for the receipt of compensation. And these outside compensation bands apply to all earned income. It doesn't matter whether it's writing, it doesn't matter whether it relates to official duties. So these are additional restrictions. So the PA and CNC employee, the application of the ban and the outside income limitation do apply for them for a book, updating a textbook, for instance, that does not relate to their official duties. They might be able to receive royalties or travel expenses to go speak about that, because royalties and travel expenses are not considered earned income. They are considered compensation under 807, but they're not considered earned income. So if it doesn't relate to official duties, the point is that you have to apply the outside income ban, you have to apply the limitation, and you would also then look to the definition there. One other thing I'll mention is that these rules all apply in the alternative. If you have a presidentially appointed person who writes a book that relates to their official duties, and royalties do not count as earned income under the ban, but they do count as compensation under 807, the point is all of these rules apply in the alternative. Whichever rule is the most restrictive is the rule that governs. So a PA employee is still subject to 807 restrictions, even though they're also subject to additional restrictions. So let's talk about an example. Let's say you have an ambassador who's coming into the State Department. So the ambassador is going to be a PA, a presidentially appointed employee, and they're going to be subject to 807 and the outsider income ban. So if they come in and they write a textbook that's not related to their official duties, typically that's going to be okay under 807, but they're not going to be able to get an advance for that book and collect that advance for a book that is updated during government service. They might be able to get royalties or travel expenses only, but anything that qualifies as a payment as outside earned income, they're still not going to be able to collect that, even though the book does not relate to their official duties, because they're subject to the PA employees subject to the ban. But as I said, if the book does relate to their official duties, they're not going to be able to receive any compensation for payments. So this is just an illustration of a person who wants to update a textbook or update another book that they previously completed, and how the compensation-related restrictions apply to them after they come in. So now I'll move on to the promotional activities portion of the advisory, unless, Patrick, we have any questions.
We do not have any questions yet.
Okay. So very frequently, it's, we've been asked, OGE's been asked to give advice to employees who want to engage in promotional activities related to a book that they've written. So it's not unusual for TV appearances, interviews in radio or newspapers, book signings, red carpet events. We have employees who've been asked to engage in promotional activities of all of those types and more over the years. So if the employee is specifically given a fee to appear or to attend one of these events and they're being paid for it, then you will have to apply the applicable rules, the compensation limitations. Now, appearing at an event is a personal service. It would be considered earned income under the ban and under the 15% limitation. So if you had a PA or a CNC employee who was offered $1,000 to appear at an event to promote their book, they wouldn't be able, well, the PA employee wouldn't be able to take it at all because they have a ban. And the covered non-career employee, would have a limit. If the book related to their official duties that they are promoting, then they wouldn't be able to accept any of it. But very often, there's no explicit, fee for attending. What happens sometimes is that a person's asked to attend one of these events for promotional activities, and you have to figure out as an ethics official, well, does the initial contract that established the relationship for writing the book include as a material term of the contract the promotional activities? So for instance, if there's a contract that is signed and one person says, I promise to give you a $20,000 advance, I promise to give you 5% of the royalties, and you promise to write the book, and you promise to engage in all necessary promotional activities. Well, in that case, if the contract calls for the activities and someone later on then engages in them while in government service, the ethics rules for compensation limitations will apply because they are receiving compensation for participating in the promotional activities because they received consideration at the time they entered into the contract. So if a person's asking you, I wrote this book and either the book was completed before I came into government or it was completed during government and I'm going to engage in these promotional activities, can I do it? And can I do it? The first thing you might want to know is, well, was it a material term of the contract that calls for them to do this? Because even if they're not receiving a specific fee for the service, they might very well be receiving compensation for the activity because it's called for in the contract. And at that point, doesn't necessarily mean that the employee in front of you can't do the promotional activities, but it might mean they can't get paid for it. And if it's already in the contract calling for it, then there's kind of no way to get unpaid for it. So it could be determined. But that is something that you would you'd want to see. So let's talk about an example. Here we have a Securities and Exchange Commission employee who writes a book that appears to be related to their official duties. And if they are asked to participate in promotional activities to promote that book that's related to their official duties, and they're only going to be able to do that if the activity, the promotional activity, is uncompensated. And it'll be uncompensated either because there's no fee for the participation or because it was not called for as a material term of the contract. Now, how does that come up where it's not a material term of the contract? So here at OGE, we've been presented with this many times. You have a person who writes a book, and either they completed it before government service or during government service. And maybe it's a book that may or may not have been expected to get a lot of publicity, but it in fact does. And so what happens is someone from a major news organization says, will you come and do an interview about your book? Will you come on TV? Can we interview and do a magazine article on you and promote the book? And they're not offering any fees. Very often, national media outlets don't offer fees. They just say, we want to interview you. There's no fee involved. And in addition, the contract is silent on it. There's no requirement in any way for the person to engage in these promotional activities. So it's just kind of an ad hoc request. You come and give an interview to Newsweek. And in that situation, there is no compensation being received. There's no compensation, there's no consideration in the contract, there's no fee for the promotional activity. So the compensation limitations would not prohibit this. Now, if you have a high-ranking political person who's being asked to do this, it might make sense to check in with the administration or with the White House to determine whether or not this is something they want one of their high-level people doing. In addition, there are many other ethics considerations that come into play, such as use of title, misuse of position, endorsement issues, use of subordinates time. So there's a lot of complicated issues that might come into play with someone who wants to use their time to promote a book. But the compensation limitation might not prohibit the person from doing this because in this instance, they're not receiving any compensation. Okay, so I'm happy to move on to the section 3 of the legal advisory, trying to sell a book idea or shop it around. But before I do that, check in with Patrick to see whether we have any questions.
Yes, Seth, we do have a question. It's sort of a general 807 question. And someone is wondering, in their hypothetical, say we had a former uniformed service member who's now serving as, say, a GS-14 civilian employee who's interested in writing a general book about his time in government service, sort of an opinion book about service in general. How would the related to standard apply to that kind of official, or is there any sort of hints or guidance you could give to someone managing that situation?
So I don't know if the question is how to analyze related to official duties or whether or not the rule applies to the person at all.
Yes, I think it's the former. So how would you determine if that book about their sort of general public service was quote unquote related to their official duties?
Okay. So first of all, I will mention that there is, I believe, an IAG webinar that's exclusively or mostly devoted to how to analyze related to official duties. So if there's a way to also direct the person to that webinar.
We'll put a link in the description right as soon as this is finished.
Right. And so if we have a regular employee, someone who's not, a presidentially appointed or covered non-career, there are several ways in which it can be related to official duties. The main way that usually is implicated is if it deals in significant part with an ongoing program, policy, or operation of the agency. And there's also if it deals in significant part with non-public information. I think those are probably the two most relevant to the situation you've described. Now, deals in significant part with an ongoing or announced program, policy, or operation of the agency. So if there's a book that's going to deal, maybe one chapter of the book is going to deal with their work, that might not deal in significant part. If it has to be an ongoing announced program, policy, operation of the agency. So if they're writing about past things that happened at the agency, but it does not involve an ongoing program, policy, or operation of the agency, then it won't be related to under that prong. Non-public information is defined many ways. Of course, if it's classified, if it's not releasable under FOIA, if the agency has declared that it is not releasable through its own internal policy, those are things that probably cannot be included in the book. But I will say that I have been asked by a lot of people in various agencies about this, and I will say that if you're going to say the reason the person cannot get paid for writing the book is because it relates to ongoing policy, program, or operation, you have to point to a very specific policy, program, or operation, and the fact that it's ongoing or announced, that maybe hasn't started yet, that you can really tie it to. And it deals in significant part, not just in passing. And as far as the non-public information, a lot of agencies, they're structured in a certain way. They have lingo, they have terminology, they have things that a person wouldn't possibly know unless they work there. And they're not things that have specifically been authorized to be released. But those types of, or things that might be embarrassing to an agency, those types of things typically are not sufficient to say that it's non-public information. You really need to point to why the information is classified, why the information would not be releasable if are asked under FOIA, or a pre-existing, internal policy of the agency that this is confidential. Because ultimately, if you can't point to something like that, you could be easily opening yourself up to a lawsuit on First Amendment grounds. So all I'd say is you have to, and also you can look at Advisory 01-X10, which talks about this, and that summarizes the Wolf case, which was a case in the 10th Circuit in 2000 or 2001, analyzing related to official duties in the case in the context of an SSA ALJ. So I would take a look at the reg, the legal advisory, that court case, and also the IEG webinar, and hopefully I've been able to partially answer your question.
Excellent. Thanks very much, Seth. I think that's going to be very, very helpful.
Okay. So trying to sell a book idea or shop a book around. So it is, does frequently happen that at the end of an administration's term or the end of an administration, there's a decent number of employees who might be looking to sell a book idea. Now, there are a lot of questions that come up in relation to the book pitch. If they're trying to make the sale, how do the rules apply? So first of all, it's clear that our rules do apply if a person hires an agent to make that pitch for them. They can't outsource the task of making the book pitch and say the rules don't apply. No, they do. In addition, if someone hires a ghostwriter, and a ghostwriter is basically a person who writes the book or the bulk of the book, but then the authorship is attributed to the employee. So they have someone else write the book for them, a ghostwriter. So writing by the ghostwriter also implicates the compensation-related restrictions. You can't outsource the writing and say, well, I didn't actually engage in any writing. In addition, and this was touched on in the advisory in 2008, if a person writes diaries, takes notes from official meetings, and uses those diaries and notes as the basis for a book contract that they sign a contract on, then those diaries and notes do constitute writing. And if they sign the contract while they're in government service, they will have received compensation for the writing. So those are some issues that come up and that are addressed here. One other thing I want to mention is you might ask yourself, well, how do you sell a book idea, or how do you communicate the idea? How does one communicate the idea of what the book's going to be about without engaging in writing and implicating the rules? Well, there are a couple ways here. If a person, through their agent or directly by themselves, summarizes the book idea, maybe it's just a rough outline, maybe it's just a summary of the idea. I want to write an autobiography, and here are some of the interesting things that have happened in my life. Chapter 1, birth. Chapter 2, school. Chapter 3, all the great things I've done. Chapter 4, all the great things I've done in government. Chapter 5, all the great things I'm going to do, and so on. That kind of level of a summary probably does not actually constitute writing in and of itself. It might be a PowerPoint presentation. But the point is, there is a way to be able to communicate the idea to a potential publisher without necessarily having engaged in writing. So the writing is maybe too inchoate. It's too incomplete to be considered writing. And so if it's in a very preliminary stage and it's just an outline of the idea, then the person might be able to present that outline and sign a contract. And in the table that we had at the beginning, that would not be, there'd be no writing activity. There would just be government service and compensation overlapping, and the compensation restrictions wouldn't apply. However, I think it's very often the case that someone has to provide more than that. They might provide their diaries. They might provide the notes they took at meetings if they're not disclosing non-public information. They might write a chapter of the book, have large segments of prose that they're proposing are going in the book, and they give that to some prospective publisher to publish, to get a contract. That would be considered writing. So I do think the best thing to do is to be able to give advice to people on this and say the less writing that you do when you're trying to sell your book, the less likely it is that if you sign the contract that the restrictions are going to apply. It's possible you might want to review it, or it's possible before they do that, or it's possible you just give them the advice and tell them, don't write a chapter, don't write prose, don't show them diaries. It really needs to be a kind of a high-level summary of the topics of the book if you're going to sign a contract for the compensation rules not to kick in. So that's one way. One way to shop a book around and not have the compensation restrictions kick in is to basically not engage in writing, but sell an idea and sign the contract. The flip side of that is that you engage in the writing. Your employee engages in the writing and maybe writes a chapter, writes several chapters. It's clear that it's writing, but they don't sign a contract. And that's writing a book on speculation. So it happens all the time that people take notes or have diaries while they're in government service. They expect to write a book someday, but they don't get a contract. There's no compensation. So after they leave, they go to publishers, and the publisher might buy that idea. The writing took place during government service. That's 2 out of the 3 factors, but the compensation didn't start until after they left. So in that case, that can be done without implicating the compensation related restrictions. Now, of course, during this process, a lot of topics, a lot of sensitive topics come up that person has to be given advice on. I mean, there's misuse of position. The person's still in government and they're trying to sell a book idea. Use of title, use of subordinates' time. A lot of times people who are leaving government and they're high ranking and they want to write a book, they will enlist subordinates to help them write that book. They also want to make sure that they're not using access to non-public information as part of that book, or they're not having their subordinates or their agent or their ghostwriter have access to information that others wouldn't have access to. So there's a lot of issues that go into that. But again, this advisory is addressing largely the compensation-related restrictions. So that's a summary of the topics questions we've received in the last 10 years or so since the first comprehensive book deal advisory. We wanted to make sure that we put them out in a timely fashion before the election, regardless of how it turned out. And I will say as a parting piece of information before I check in with Patrick to see if we received any more questions, is that because these are complicated issues, I would just suggest, to the extent that it's possible, that you give advice to your employees as early as possible on their book deals, because if they go ahead and do some of these things prior to consulting with you, they might actually reduce their ability to write their book and get paid, where if they'd come to you first, they could have done it permissibly and actually done so. So that's all I have for today. I'm checking with Patrick to see whether he has any questions.
Thanks, Seth. Thanks for this presentation. I hope this is very helpful to people, especially if you have people in your agency right now contemplating writing books. At the moment, we do not have any further questions. We can hold on for just a few seconds more to see if any come in. But thank you very much for joining us today. Thank you for the time to sort of share the highlights from this recent advisory.
Thanks.
And I'm not showing any more questions. As always, if you think of questions later, you can feel free to reach out to your desk officer for assistance, and they'll put you in touch with whoever at OGE can help you the best. So thank you all for joining us, and thank you, Seth, for joining us, and we look forward to serving you in a broadcast again soon.